Hello, everyone. This is Ted Williams here with TedWilliams3rd.com. Unfortunately, our nation has experienced another tragic mass shooting. And as we debate gun control this week, many people suggest that there's nothing we can do about these kinds of incidents happening because the Second Amendment gives us the right to bear arms. Well, I want to talk about what the Second Amendment says. I want to talk about a little history, and I want to talk more importantly about what the rest of the Constitution says around this issue. So here we go. The Second Amendment, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. This was passed in 1791 as a part of the Bill of Rights, which was a group of rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, designed to protect the individual from the power of the federal government. However, even when it was passed, there were restrictions around some of these rights. For instance, the Second Amendment, many people believe that we had the universal right to carry weapons, but when it was passed, you could not carry a weapon into a federal building. Now, fast forward to today. There have been two recent Supreme Court cases, D.C. versus Heller and McDonald versus Chicago, that have asserted the individual right to carry weapons. The Supreme Court ruled in both cases. Both situations were handgun bans had been passed in D.C. and Chicago. The Supreme Court overturned those bans, suggesting the Second Amendment gives a protected individual right to carry a weapon. Now, the McDonald case was ruled 5-4. 5 Supreme Court justices ruled for the individual right, but 4 of them said that that right was connected to a militia and could be restricted by municipalities when they felt that it was necessary, which I think is a very interesting question, because what is a militia, and is this notion of rights disconnected from a militia, is that a constitutional principle? Well, let's read what the Constitution says. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution lays out a definition for the militia and a structure for the militia. Let's read it. Here we go. To provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. By the way, Article 1 covers the powers of the legislative branch. So it says the legislative branch has the authority to oversee the militia, to call it forth, to execute the nation's laws, to suppress insurrections, and to repel invasions. Let's continue to read. To provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for governing such part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States. Hear me clearly, folks. The government has the authority to arm, to organize, and to discipline this militia according to the Constitution, reserving to the states, respectively, the appointment of the officers and the authority of training the militia according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. Listen clearly. I think this could not be more clear. The militia, under the authority of the state government, taking its directives from the Congress, has the ability to be called upon to protect the nation in times of crisis. The founding fathers very clearly wanted a situation where you'd have a lot of citizens with arms who would be organized and trained and disciplined by the government, who could be called on as a volunteer army in times of crisis. Ladies and gentlemen, in 2017, the National Guard serves that function. I would suggest that you will not find a definition of bearing arms or a definition of militia in the Constitution that says that individuals should have that right to protect themselves from criminals or protect themselves from the government. That is not a clear part of the Constitution. Now, many people say founding fathers had different opinions, etc. I'm just reading what is in the text. And if you understand this, there has been controversy around this issue for many, many years. Today, we don't even have this debate. We basically debate. One side says we should have background checks and have restrictions on automatic weapons and semi-automatic weapons. The other side says we really should have no restrictions whatsoever. Well, neither one get to having this conversation. I think we should have this debate in our society, because the right, who is against gun control very heavily, is correct. They're right, right? Is correct in their assessment that in the Vegas shooting, gun control laws as they stand would have done absolutely positively nothing. So let's go further, shall we? Let's talk about whether we should even have a proliferation of over 300 million guns with 300 million people in this country at all, if that was even the intention of the founding fathers, or was there something more organized? Maybe there was something more collective. Maybe there was something more directed to the citizens being connected with the government and exercising the authority of the government in temporary times when there was not a standing army and there were not police forces running around in all the various states. Folks, think about it for a second. The idea that all of us would run around armed, not for the purposes of being connected with a militia, but just for our own individual purposes, even protection. Listen, I just don't think it's in the Constitution. Now, we could have the debate around whether guns are good for protecting people, et cetera, but you really cannot make the argument strictly from the Constitution unless you look at context. This is very important. This is not an academic exercise, folks. People are dying. 30,000 gun deaths in this country every year, 11,000 murders, 19,000 suicides. People are dying. Handguns, which we're not even talking about banning in this country, are used in 70% of murders in the United States. And there are countries that have figured out how to get through this. Japan has figured out how to get through this. Australia's figured out how to get through this. Great Britain has figured out how to get through this. Why can't we learn from these nations and start changing the way that we worship the Second Amendment? The Second Amendment is not a religion. We should not worship the Second Amendment like we worship the cross of Christ, folks. We should not worship the Second Amendment like we worship, some people worship Allah. Come on, think about this. In a society that I think is only going to get worse in this way, ladies and gentlemen, if you cannot get gun control after Sandy Hook, if you can't get gun control after all of these violent issues, I don't think there's going to be any additional changes after the Vegas situation, which I think is tragic. But the fact of the matter is, it's time for us to start having a conversation about whether the Second Amendment really actually protects this right. I know many people will be very upset about this, but that's okay. That's why we live in a free society. We should at least have the conversation. It might save a few lives.